Good afternoon and really warm welcome to Improving Practice Working Group webinar. We have been doing these kind of webinars during the summer and now continuing in autumn. Today we will have several GPPAC colleagues working together. John Rudy, who is the leading facilitator, and Mark Batek will give example from Philippines. I will say a little bit more about their professional experience after this introduction to GPPAC. For those of you who don't know the network, it is a member-led network of civil society organizations working on conflict prevention and peace building in 15 regions of the world. And our mission is to promote a global shift in peace building, how the armed conflicts is dealt with, so not to react but to prevent all armed conflicts. You can see GPPAC regions, and there are many, and we have some joint projects, but most interestingly we work in some working group like this one, Improving Practice and Education for Peace. There are several more youth, peace and security working group, for example, who would be interested in more. There are also interesting materials on GPPAC website and useful practice books. So that is the map of our regions, and that is more people are joining us. So I'm making, I admitting them. So sorry for small breaks. So a little bit more about this group, GPPAC Improving Practice Working Group. Aim is to improve the way conflict prevention peace building is done in practice, and that is human security and multi-stakeholder approach. So, sorry, I have to admit participants. So the work of the group is based on the principle that human security and multi-stakeholder approach. So that you know a little bit more about faces also, you can connect us. This is from the meeting in Vienna, and John is the person, the tall man with the glasses. I'm pointing at him. This is Lucy. Mark, where are you? Yeah, here is Mark. This is me talking. And our colleague Zal from Caucasus, for example, Pam from Southern Africa, Adivasu, and so on. So these are the colleagues who are joining efforts and working together in Improving Practice Work Group. I think that this is good enough about Improving Practice Working Group. I would like to introduce our facilitators and presenters for today. Let me just stop sharing. And first of all, our colleague John Rudy, who has got really huge experience in working on human security, peace building, conflict transformation, and non-violence, with more than 30 years work, practical work in 30 countries of Asia and Africa. He is an 18-year veteran facilitator, that's how he calls himself, at the Mindanao Peace Building Institute, and also works regularly in Eastern Africa, including University of Hadesha, Somaliland. For 6 years, he was based in Swaziland, working through Southern Africa for the Mennonite Central Committee. So John served as a peacemaker in residence for Elizabethtown College Central for Global Understanding and Peacemaking from 2020 to 2019. He was a senior fellow for human security and allies for peace building. He worked for UNDP also. And John served in the Mennonite Central Committee in Somalia Primary Agreement, for example, so that you know a little bit about his work. John holds MA in Religion with a Gratitude Certificate in Conflict Transformation from East Mennonite University. And since he asked me to shorten his bio, I think that this is for now okay. and our colleague Mark Batak, who is joining us from Philippines. He manages the program of the Initiatives for International Dialogue. That is the member organization to GPPAC, a Philippine-based regional peace building and advocacy institution working for inclusive peace processes in Southeast Asia. He is also the regional liaison officer for the GPPAC Southeast Asia Network. He focuses on practice and study of continuous politics, conflict and violence, and peace processes, and social movements. And with this, I will end my presentation and ask my colleague John Rudy to start sharing his screen and to guide us through design of multi-stakeholder processes. That's what we are going to talk about today. So throughout the 3 days, we will have inputs on design and facilitation of multi-stakeholder processes and some examples from the field work. So John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tanya, and welcome everybody. We're glad you're here, and hope that this series of sessions will be very useful to you. Would like to start with a resource. GPPAC has produced a multi-stakeholder processes, conflict information, and peace building manual that's free to download. So the link is there, and perhaps Christina or Tanya, you could find the link and put it in the chat. There's also a QR code if you wish to flash that and have it come up on your phone. Our schedule of the 3 days looks like this. Today, we're going to look at what are the design elements of an MSP. What do you have to think through if you're going to design a multi-stakeholder process? Tomorrow, and then Mark will give us an excellent case study from that design. Tomorrow, then will be so you have a multi-stakeholder process. How do you facilitate it? What are some of the issues and elements there? Tanya will be giving us a case study from South Serbia. Thursday, we'll have a case study from Fiji, and then we'll do some breakout group conversations based around some key questions. Now, understanding that the content of multi-stakeholder process isn't clean. Like when you divide it up into design and facilitation, there's a lot of overlap in that. So if you do see some overlap, just know that's kind of what, that's the nature of it. Today then we're going to do a very brief human security recap. Designing legitimacy, power issues, the what and whys of a multi-stakeholder process, and then the process model of designing a multi-stakeholder process. We'll try to cover that very quickly today, and then we'll have the case study. We will have some time for Q&A or comments or thoughts. So the UN has a very simple definition of human security. Freedom from fear, freedom from want, and to live in dignity, or freedom from indignity. And I find this a very useful definition. We've talked a lot about, we understand what gives us fear. We know when there are situations of want, whether it's from famine or natural disaster, that are causing, the basic human needs to be unmet. Dignity is one that I find fascinating to include in a basic definition of human security. We do understand that dignity is critically important for people's. It's a basic need of security. Indignity is causing lots of harm around the world, and brain scientists are actually telling us that a wounding to dignity registers in the brain, lights up the brain, the centers of the brain in the same way that physical harm does, a broken bone, for example, or a bruise. So wounding dignity really has an impact on the security of people. Quickly, 5 basic principles of human security. that it's people-centered. This is a critical piece. It's not economic-centered. It's not border-centric. It's actually people first. And to even shift the language to people first is a critical part of this. It's comprehensive, and that is that it is interactive with freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom from indignity. It's multi-sectoral. It's not just the job of the police or the military, excuse me, to ensure security. It's every sector that we deal with. And the fourth one is it's context specific. Something designed in the Philippines will not work in the US just by transferring it. It has to be put into the context in which the insecurity that we're addressing is understood and analyzed. And then 5, it's prevention oriented. So we're thinking ahead about what might cause insecurity. We're not just reacting, but we're planning ahead. We're thinking about this. We're designing multi-stakeholder processes to address the future insecurities that may arise. Now, I took this picture a number of years ago, but I want to ask you a question, and just think about this in your mind here. The first question is, what do you think are the greatest insecurities facing this woman and child? This was taken on the Tonle Sap River in Cambodia. This is one of the families that lives right on the river. What do you think her greatest insecurities, their greatest insecurities might be? This is a basic question because remember, we're people-centric in working with multi-stakeholder processes. So we have to have human faces to this question of insecurities and the other side of the coin, the securities. The second question then would be, of anyone, anywhere, who could contribute positively toward the security of these two? And so we're also thinking about the who of security. And again, something basic. Yeah, a home. A home is security. And believe it or not, thank you for that comment. This woman and child are on their home. This boat is their home. This is where they spend their time. And so to be there at home gives them a sense of security. And I'm certainly in this pandemic, right? To be home, to be in our home, it is a sense of security. To go out in the streets where we know there's a virus might give us a high level of insecurity. So the question of who can contribute to security is a critical one when designing a multi-stakeholder process. And so we'll keep that question in the back of our mind as we go through this material today. Now, what is the definition of a multi-stakeholder process? Well, let's break it down, right? Multi meaning more than two groups or parties or entities. A stakeholder, anyone who has an interest or a stake in a specific issue is a stakeholder. And then a process is not just the template. It's called a process for a reason. It's an open-ended, it's fluid. It's a forum or a platform that's structured, and you develop partnerships within this process in an MSP or a multi-stakeholder process where particular sets of groups interact. And to get this is important around joint objectives, rules of engagement, and they can be formal or informal. So this whole process, multi-stakeholder process, is this very complex coming together of a group around a certain topic. One more dynamic we have to consider before design is legitimacy. These multi-stakeholder processes are a process based on finding greater security for a group of people. And their legitimacy would arise out of a social contract that says this process has got to be helpful. And the coming together of this process has to at least equal, if not outweigh, the risks and the freedoms that individuals in the multi-stakeholder process will give up. For example, if a group of rural stakeholders comes to a multi-stakeholder process, they have to trust in this process enough to risk perhaps sitting around the table with the very people who may perceive as threatening their own security. So in unstable areas, rural areas, rural people who are harassed by military, by rebel groups, if they're going to join that group has to have enough legitimacy that they say this is worth that risk. So that's the legitimacy. Now, legitimacy failures, on the other hand, will come when one group dominates and not everyone is experiencing those benefits. If someone, if the process is continuing to wound the dignity of one party or another, then this is a legitimacy failure in the multi-stakeholder process. Now, one of the key dynamics we have to pay attention to in terms of legitimacy or illegitimacy of a multi-stakeholder process is actually we have to understand the power dynamics in the around the table in the room of this multi-stakeholder process. So we have to deal with power imbalances, and if we are the people who are designing this multi-stakeholder process. And tomorrow we'll look a little bit about group dynamics and how to balance these power relations. But we have to understand that power will be expressed. One way at Mindanao Peacebuilding Institute, we level the power in the room when we have very powerful actors and others who come from less perceived powerful situations. We require that people take off their uniforms, that don't wear their uniforms, but wear street clothes to the training, because uniforms project power, police, military, there are other kinds of uniforms that project power, and we require that you leave that at the door. You leave that power, and so we're helping to balance power. The same way in a multi-stakeholder process. So power can't be ignored. Vulnerable groups are the ones who stand to lose the most and can be sidelined by either tokenism or lose their own legitimacy with their own people back home if they join these processes. So we really have to understand the power, and trust is a key part of balancing that power. So the question of why a multi-stakeholder coordination or designing these processes. And two important points, and that is to achieve some common purpose, right? We don't design these things so that everybody can go their own way. No, we're actually addressing a specific challenge or problem, or trying to achieve some kind of purpose. The second thing then is to at least understand, and perhaps develop a shared theory of change, TOC, theory of change. So we can't achieve that purpose unless we work together. And working together means talking through, how do we think this thing will change for the better of all people? And so developing a shared theory of change is one of those dynamics that is one of the tasks, if it doesn't come already prepackaged with the group. And chances are, if you bring a diverse group of people together, they're not going to share the same theory of change. So those two things. Now, and then this third point here, so where might we want to use a multi-stakeholder coordination or multi-stakeholder process? Where might we want to develop it? Civilian protection, disaster relief, humanitarian assistance, peace processes, policy implementation, shared information, coordination of peace building work, human security coordination. And that's what we've been focusing on here at GPPAC. We have been really looking at human security and how do we coordinate around that. So just to give you on a spectrum that includes increasing complexity, increasing time commitment, increasing trust among the coordination members. If you see on this, the left side, sometimes it's hard enough to just share information in a transparent way, right? But see, that's the most basic task of a multi-stakeholder process. And if you move through joint capacity building and joint conflict analysis and then designing strategies, it's one thing to design strategies, but then you have to implement them. And it's and the last and probably most complex is actually monitoring the impact of that. Because if the monitoring of the impact of joint projects in a multi-stakeholder process gets you to the point where you can look at failures or lack of the impact that you intended, and agree on how to change that project. This is a task that is essential if we're going to make the changes that we think we're going to make in this process. So just to understand, there are various levels of coordination, and some may never get beyond joint information sharing, but that may be a critical piece that's missing in any peace or conflict situation. I'm breezing through this really quickly, so please be thinking about your questions. You can even be putting those in the chat now if you want to, and we'll loop back around at the end here. I do want to now think about, there's a couple of major approaches to designing these multi-stakeholder processes. And if you think in terms of focusing on a specific problem, it could be insecurity in terms of natural disasters. It could be food insecurities, right? It could be focusing on a piece of legislation. That's a problem focused. If we look at a conflict focused approach to understanding why we need a multi-stakeholder process, think of domestic violence, for example, organizing around that, or communal clashes, or some kind of conflict that is really tearing the fabric of society. In the US right now, we need tremendous amount of multi-stakeholder processes around our political factions. The last, though, I find is an appreciative. It's a positive one. It is organizing around opportunities. So the opportunities, for example, around resource extraction. Yes, I know that's a dirty word in many places. How about new political processes that are emerging, or even grant acquisition? If a group of people design a multi-stakeholder process because there are resources like money available to put to use, that would be a positive. That would be an opportunity-focused reason. Okay, so that's in the initial design to think, well, what's the purpose of this MSP? Now we're going to look at a model for the process model and think about the various stages we have to design and put energy into making sure that we understand where we are in the design process. The first is, so this process model comes from the MSP guide. You can see mspguide.org. They have a whole website. And again, I will give you later on the link for this. I don't think I generated a QR code for this yet, but you can just go to mspguide.org, and there's videos, and they do have their own manual as well. So this model comes from them. So initiating, adaptive planning, collaborative action, reflective monitoring. Let's take a look at the issues based around initiating an MSP. So you may have one person who circulates around and saying, hey, we need to coordinate based on this issue. And that involves, understanding, developing trust so that people feel free to come to that initial meeting, identifying the opportunities, how might someone benefit from joining this process, generating visions, helping people to understand what could be the outcome of this, and agreeing on strategies, identifying actions and responsibilities, and then communicating what that first step, the outcome is for that first step I'm sorry, I was on the wrong slide. So Claire, I have my, so the initiating process is to clarify, it's to do some analysis, it's to establish the steering body. And that's a critical one. Like, who's going to take the lead on this? Because again, we ask that question, who? And it has to do with who is trusted by everybody to convene this thing. Not everybody has everybody else's trust, and that will come later with the process of the MSP. Establishing the scope and the mandate. What will and will not you address during this? And then establish the process with which you come together. Even the shape of the table sometimes is an important part of this initiating. So then the planning, and that is this adaptive planning builds trust as you are flexible and fluid with, and all of these situations that we're addressing will take some fluidity with them because, these are highly dynamic situations we're approaching here with our MSP. Identifying issues and generating the vision for the future. What is our outcome? Examining future scenarios, and this is the adaptability part of this MSP. Identifying actions, responsibility, and then communicating outcomes. So the first is kind of the inner work of the MSP, and now the second one, then the collaborative action, is actually doing what we say we're going to do. Who's going to do what? So it's the action plans, the resources and support, the capacities for action. It's working with the structures, and it's implementing, and it's keeping people's energy up and to keep commitment to this process. There are times when it doesn't feel like anything's moving or happening, and perhaps the convener needs to kind of keep that energy going. And then the final process here then is that reflective. It's that more complex stage about creating that learning culture that says, wow, how do we do it better in the next round of programming? It's deciding, well, so what is important in evaluating this action that we've done? And it's developing those mechanisms. It's generating lessons learned. And then deciding, well, so how are we going to do this better? So this is a brief overview of the reflective model. And I think for some of you, if you want to take a screenshot of this or a picture of this, this is kind of puts it all together. I think we'll revisit this on the third day, where we can work a bit in smaller groups on this. We'll hold the clarifying questions, but again, if you do think of questions that you'd like to address, please drop them into the chat and we'll loop back around there. But I think for now, Mark, you want to tell us, bring us your case study, and we welcome hearing you. And I'll stop sharing here now. Okay.
Thank you, John. Uh, so I'll ask for help from Christina to lift my presentation. Maybe you could go to the first slide there. So I'll share about um, what the MSP involved in the Mindanao Peace Weavers, and as well as the crafting, the development of the Mindanao People's Peace Agenda. I'll explain what this is in my discussion, but next slide. But just to put a a visual on what was the output. Again, uh, as John already said, multi-stakeholder process is not a it's a it's a point in it's a milestone. It's a part of a chain of events. So as the word process means, it it's supposed to not be a one-off activity. But I want to put in front of you this uh, publication, which is entitled "Towards Mindanao's People's Peace Agenda," just to have an anchor on what we are talking about. This will be my flow of discussion, or the focus of my discussion. I was asked to discuss the first one. What was the multi-stake holder process for? And then I'll move on to the second one, which is um, what were the considerations in designing the methodology or designing the process. And finally, some lessons, insights, both what were the successes of the process, but at the same time, what were the limitations or challenges that were faced during the um, uh, process. Next slide, please. So let me begin. Let me start with the takeaways, because usually when doing the presentation, we will only look at the takeaways or the conclusions, reflections at the end. But I want to already put this in front at the beginning, so that you could also analyze with me the case study, because that is the point of doing this case study. We are not saying that the case study is perfect, but we just want to know how it was applied, what are the lessons, what were the moving parts, and how do we improve on the process in applying it to other processes. So some of the takeaways, and I'm presenting this on behalf of my organization. In preparation for this presentation, I consulted with our executive director, our program coordinator on Mindanao. At the same time, consulted with key partners. So there are four uh, things that takeaways from this process and the development of the Mindanao People's Peace Agenda. The first one is that, um, as you've seen as well in the presentation of John, it's not a linear process. And in fact, at some points, however best effort we put into clarifying how the process will be, the the process that we will take might not be the same as what we originally envisioned, because partly we are adapting to a changing circumstance. There are political circumstances that surface, and we have to address those. So it's an iterative process, an adaptive one. But I think our anchor is number two. An understanding of the context and the problem should be there, and the collective goal and principle should be clear. Although, of course, it's flexible for continuous learning and renegotiation. Number three is that the primary resources for conducting this process are the relationships built even before the initiators and the stakeholders expressly agreed to enter this process, or before they agreed to do a joint planning or joint strategizing. And so in this case study that I want to share to you is that I want to share a two-level multi-stakeholder process wherein the agenda itself is went through a multi-stakeholder process, but at the same time, it's only part of a bigger process of the convening, the consolidation, the joint action of the network itself, which is the Mindanao Peace Weavers. And finally, that the process does not end. So it's, and since current MSPs are built on previous MSPs, then the current MSP will also build on, or will be the foundation for future ones. Next slide. So what's the purpose of this particular MSP multi-stakeholder process that I want to discuss with you next? So the background of the Mindanao People's Peace Agenda, again, this is an agenda of civil society and community actors primarily based in Mindanao, but also those outside Mindanao. I'll discuss the format of this, but just to provide a background for those who are not familiar with the context. The Bangsamoro region has been struggling for its right to self-determination for 5 to 6 decades already. The insurgency has been there since 1969. There's of course some debates that it even started earlier. There are multiple layers of conflict uh, drivers, at the same time multiple conflict actors, and we know that there are existing talks in various administrations with two of the main conflict actors, the Moro National Liberation Front, MNLF, and then the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. I will not go into details of this, but just to provide the background of why the MPPA was needed. So next slide. So this is just a brief a visual of the various conflict actors involved in all over Mindanao. It's not just the MILF and the MNLF that are in there. There are of course other armed groups that are not in negotiations with the government, and some others that are not predominantly Moro or Muslim in nature. For example, the New People's Army, they are a communist armed insurgency. Next slide. So now, what is the Mindanao Peace Weavers, which the network that anchored this Mindanao People's Peace Agenda process? So the network was conceptualized in 2003. This was right after, or a month after, the Bulyok War in central Philippines, and amid the calls for stronger ceasefire advocacy. It was formally founded, however, and launched a year after in 2004, and originally launched by 7 member networks spanning identity-based divides between the Bangsamoro, indigenous peoples, and Christian settlers. So, which those familiar with the Mindanao dynamics is called the tri-people. And the goal of the network is to promote civil society participation in the peace process and demand peace and human security as a matter of policy for Mindanao. Next slide. So again, weaving, in the name of the network, weaving is central to that. So it was used as a metaphor wherein we weave together our expertise, identities, visions, at the same time our tensions, even our respective conflicts, to be able to produce something better. And next slide. Eventually, when this was formed, MPW was formed around 4 secretariats. It has 4 secretariats and 8 member networks called convenors. Let's jump first to the next slide, Christina, just so to show. So these are the 4 secretariats. My organization, IID, is the lead secretariat, but there are other co-secretariats like CRS, Balay Mindanao, and Saligan. And then there are 8 convenors. These are some of the biggest networks, peace networks, humanitarian networks, engaging the peace process in Mindanao. Agong Peace Network, BISDAC, who are based in the Visayas, CDCS, ISMP, MPAC, MPC, and then MPPM, Mindanao People's Peace Movement, and Mindanao Solidarity Network, which is based in the Luzon and Visayas. And currently there are new members. MPI, John is affiliated with MPI, Peace Builders Community, and World Vision Philippines. Let's go back to the former slide. The point of this, having this broad-based network is because some members, we, a lot of organizations have been working on different aspects of the conflict for the longest time, or different geographic locations. Some are working with indigenous peoples, some are working with in the island groups in Zamboanga, Sulu, Basilan, Tawi-Tawi. Some others are in Central Luzon, some others are more oriented on peace education, some others on legal aid, etc. And so it's not directly on peace advocacy, the focus of all this, but rather on different strategies. But that also made MPW uh, um, uh, um, also quite a mosaic of different resources and expertise. Um, and next slide, and next slide again. Yeah. So these were the objectives of the MPW when it was started. It was participation of civil society in the peace process, consensus building, information sharing, unified actions, building of a peace constituency, and then involving a common agenda. Next slide. However, even when there was already an attempt to create a network of networks, there is still a lot of observations, and rightfully so, a lot legitimate observations and critique assessment that there's a need for the peace building community, humanitarian community, human rights community to shift from being reactive to be doing more prevention work, but at the same time also improving on its collaboration. So, for example, this um, article in 2006 says that despite the many ways in which NGOs and other civil societies contributed in peace building in Mindanao, we were not as successful in halting the war. We were basically reacting. So, for example, MPW was formed out of a need to a call for bilateral ceasefire between the government of Arroyo, President Arroyo, and the MILF in 2003. So it's quite reactive, and with and it says here, without a consolidated civil society effort, grassroots could not effectively be mobilized for actively resolving conflict. Next slide. So hence, it became more apparent that we need to do the Mindanao People's Peace Agenda. What is the Mindanao People's Peace Agenda, and what, again, now answering why we had to do that? It was a 2-year process of consultation and agenda development process from 2009 to 2010, spanning um, consultations across Mindanao as well as outside Mindanao, but primarily led by Mindanao civil society and stakeholders. Um, there are 2 reasons for this. The first one is there's a need to deepen consensus and strengthen ways of working among civil society and stakeholders. And number 2 is there's an opportunity to engage in a more coordinated manner. Back then, the Memorandum of Agreement on Ancestral Domain, back then when the MPPA was being planned, this was the political context. So it was both this was the internal context, a need to strengthen the network, but at the same time, an external context, which is we need to engage the ongoing peace process, particularly the development of the MOA AD. So as you can see, this is primarily an opportunity-focused MSP, the development of the MPPA. Civil society wanted to strengthen its ability to engage an existing political development. But also it's also mixed, of course, with the problem focus, because the context is we are responding to an existing problem, which is, again, an ongoing violence in a lot in many parts of Mindanao. Next slide. So now let me move on to the methodology. What kind of process was used? Next slide. So these are the key considerations in the design of the MPPA, the development and consultations for the MPPA, or let me call it the people's agenda. Why is this, for example, why is it the time for the crafting of the MPPA? For example, the network was already formed in 2003, but why is it only in 2007-8 that it was ideated? Um, it was because there's the the ongoing already development of the memorandum of agreement on the ancestral domain. So there's an opportunity for us to engage, and we have to work better so that we could bring the agenda of the communities that we work with in the agenda of or the tables, the existing peace tables. But eventually, as some of you know, the peace talks back then fell apart. So originally, the reason for the immediate context for doing the MPPA was the engagement on the MOA AD. But since the peace process fell apart because the Supreme Court shut down this agreement, now the network still agreed, and in fact, it made the urgency of developing more concrete people's agenda more urgent. So and that's why more resources was put into it in developing it for 2009 and until 2010. So it was a 2-year project. Who will lead the process of crafting the MPPA? John was asking about legitimacy. Legitimacy is very important for especially for this process. Who has the resources to facilitate? Who has the skills to facilitate? The good thing is, again, one of my key takeaways in my earlier slide, my assertion is that the MPPA is situated in a broader multi-stakeholder process, which is the network itself, the Mindanao Peace Weavers. And so that is the strength that was that we didn't have to start with from zero, because that means the network has vast legitimacy to do this. So the core group, the conveners and the secretariats, the 8 conveners and the 4 secretariats became the core group of this process. But at the same time, they also became the facilitators of the various consultations. And who were included, then the good thing again is the Mindanao Peace Weavers, the MPW, the network, represents different organizations with hundreds of member organizations, ranging from Muslim communities, Christian settler communities, indigenous peoples communities, peace educators, academics, faith-based organizations, NGOs who have different alliances with these sectors, NGOs who have different ideologies as to the process, whether to call for a referendum, whether to proceed with the political negotiation and settlement, and with organizations, youth organizations and women organizations in their respective networks. And the geographic spread was not just across Mindanao, southern Philippines, but the membership also ranges to Visayas and to Luzon. Next slide, please. So in designing who was going to be involved, the primary people who were involved were the members, community members, and um, CSO members of the big networks. And therefore, they are the ones who were envisioned to own the process. So that ranges from those who are formal NGOs and those who are people's organizations or community-based organizations. And of course, issues about uh, do we limit this to Mindanao CSOs or do we include Luzon and Visayas? Eventually, since the network MPW has Visayas and Luzon members, they were of course included. It's not just limited to Mindanao actors, because it was realized that solidarity, joint action needs to be also done with partners in Luzon and Visayas. And of course, the tri-people character, Bangsamoro, predominantly Muslim, non-Moro indigenous peoples, and then Christian settlers. And of course, including the gender and age dimensions within that network. And how do we relate with each other given power relations? John mentioned something about the power dynamics. For example, non-Moro indigenous peoples feel that they are not as there's power imbalance between them and their Muslim counterparts, because their Muslim counterparts are in the formal process. And I think that is why having the network of networks as the anchor and the facilitator of this process help make sure that these power imbalances are are balanced out. That's why we have 4 secretariats and 8 convening networks to make sure that no one organization monopolizes the process, or no one sector monopolizes the process. Next slide. The design of the MPPA, it's 2-year consultations, 2009 to 2010. And then we had a general set of questions that they could adapt to their respective consultations. And but what I wanted to note is these questions are usually found in conflict analysis anyways. But what is critical for this process is that there's so much time devoted into it. It was a 2-year process, but at the same time, because it's a the nature is tri-people participants, it became a coming together as well. It became a dialogue as well of the participants, in wherein they are not just going to share their views, but also to listen to each other and be willing to persuaded, where their positions might also change in the process of dialogue. Next slide. So in this, in as a next step, the responses to this questions, to these consultations, were then processed by the core group. Again, it's the 4 secretariats and the 8 convening networks, and then written down, sharpened, and then following revisions, the draft was again submitted, shared with the assembly, and an advisory group representing again the tri-people, the 3 main sectors inhabiting Mindanao. And it was eventually launched in 2010, in April 2010. Next slide. So this were just a snapshot of some of the 15-point consensus point. It's a lengthy document because it sets out shared principles, shared goals, shared strategies. Next slide. So it ranges from human rights, good governance, sustainable development, environment, and many others. So it's a 15-point agenda. Next slide. Let me first go to the insights before I go to the what happened, what were the results of this process. Next slide. Again, reminding, looking again at the takeaways, the MPPA as an MSP process that is part of a bigger MSP process, which is the network itself. And the drafting, consolidation of the people's agenda is just one of the various meetings, strategy meetings that happened across the years. So in 2010, 2010 wasn't the end of the meetings and consolidation of the network. That was again just a milestone in an entire process of consolidation. So which brings us to the 4th takeaway, which is the process does not end. And next slide. Next slide. I'm now in next slide. Yeah. So I am now in my final slide. So what were the results of that, and what do I mean by the process does not end? So the MPPA was used by the networks and its member networks and its constituencies to engage the eventual development of the framework agreement of the Bangsamoro and the comprehensive agreement of the Bangsamoro under the new administration, under the then President Benigno Aquino. So as we know, that those agreements were also the basis for the enabling law, the Bangsamoro Basic Law, or the Bangsamoro Organic Law, which formed the new expanded BARM, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. The picture that I'm showing you is the meeting that we held. There's another multi-stakeholder process that we did last July. So this is again hosted by the Mindanao Peace Weavers, And again, adopting the same design as the development of the MPPA, the consultations, each key network member, there are 8 of us, and then four secretariat, so that makes us 12. Each of us organized 12 um, small workshops. So this one didn't span 2 years. This one spanned only 4 years, 4 years, 4 months. This one is in relation to agenda, developing policy agenda in relation to the BARM or post-agreement phase, and in relation to COVID. What's the critical agenda points at this time? So this was a mix of online and offline, face-to-face meetings. So the topics that were discussed here ranged from land rights, uh, um, violent extremism and terrorism, human rights, and many others. Um, and this 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 most recent MSP was built upon the lessons from the previous process of the MPPA, but also using those agreements already built in the MPPA to again further develop particular agenda points at this current period. Can you, Christina, shift to the last to the slide before this one? Sorry, before, yeah, there. So what are the, since the MPPA, the development of the MPPA is situated within the broader multi MSP, multi-stakeholder process of the Mindanao Peace Weavers, that means the limitations, successes, the strengths and weaknesses of the network itself applied as well in the process of developing the Mindanao People's Peace Agenda, or the MPPA. Next slide, Christina. There. So this is a study, impact assessment study, that was conducted by CDA in uh, a year and a half ago, or in fact 2 years ago, on what were the success factors and the challenges. I think this is relevant to analyzing what were the challenges and the success factors as well of the MPPA, because as I've said, the limitations of the MPW applied to the MPPA, because the design in the conduct of the MPPA was adopted through the MPW. For example, the conduct of the consultations were left to the kind of structure that we have in the Mindanao Peace Weavers. So some of the success factors that were identified were there was sustained engagement and commitment among different network members. Number two, it's self-sustaining because of the interdependence. You know, there's different members have different strengths, and which means that although we are a network, um, each member network can contribute what their strengths are. And number three is the moral imagination, which is, I think, the strength of the network, wherein different stakeholders do not only use this for crafting joint actions, but it's also a space for them to build solidarity, to dialogue among each other. So this is a quite, you know, complicated but also special process, because the people who are organizing the MSP are not external parties. We are involved, we are conflict actors ourselves. You know, we are Bangsamoro, we are indigenous peoples, we are Christian settlers, we are also from Mindanao and outside Mindanao. So the dynamics and conflict within us have to be discussed in the process. And which leads us to the challenges. Number one is that the contextual strains also affect network unity, and of course the unity of and the quality of the MPPA, the people's agenda. For example, there are some times wherein the dialogue and the consultation and the consolidation of the agenda hits a wall because of dynamics between conflict actors. For example, indigenous peoples and Muslims, or between civil society organizations that um, have are just from different for example, those who are based in the island groups feel that they are not involved as much as those who are in the mainland Mindanao, or between NGOs who have more funding and less funding. Which leads me now to the second challenge, which is funding. Sustaining MSPs, improving on MSPs, learning on MSPs requires resources. And that leads us to resources for sustaining momentum and impact over time. We are happy and we are, I think, privileged that CDA and some external actors come in every now and then to interview and conduct impact assessments, because sometimes it's not resourced. Resources are not put into impact assessment and learning. And partners such as GPPAC, CDA, Alliance for Peace Building, they are there to assist us in this process. And another limitation is, of course, the multi-tier network, because it's such a huge network. It's a network of networks, which means that some members in the core, who are core members of the main networks, feel, of course, know more about the process compared to the second or third tiers. For example, the member organizations of the member organizations of the member of the convener. So which means it's an onion, but at the same time, those who are in the main networks are, of course, more informed, have more say on what's happening compared to the member of the member of the member. But that is why the MPPA was needed, because the MPPA, that shifted the participation. So because now the convening groups, the core group, were now asking those who are in the third and second tiers to input on what's the agenda, what's the concrete agenda that will shape basically the strategy of the network for the next years. Next, you could check the assessment of CDA as well in the slides. I cited the study. Next slide, and the next slide. And I think this is the end of my case, the case study. If you have any questions, of course, and you want more information, you could email us. But I think it's now time for questions, and as well as inputs and observations. We'd love to hear from all of you. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark, for this very extensive and interesting presentation, and for all insights and challenges that you explained to us. So I would like to open the floor for questions. You can type them in the chat, or you can raise the hand, because we are a nice group, not too many people, 17 altogether online. So if you want to raise the hand and ask directly questions to John or Mark, because we heard them both, you can choose, and then we can pick up questions and direct them to the speakers.
Maybe while we're waiting for those questions, just a couple of reflections on Mark's presentation. You know, thank you, Mark, for this case study. It's probably one of the more complex in the world. What is happening in Mindanao with the Mindanao Peace Weavers and this decadal process reminds us, that the complexity of our multi-stakeholder process to make an impact sometimes mirrors the complexity of the conflict and the age of it itself. And so we can't expect to come together in a process in a year and, you know, and have total solutions. So I think this case study is very helpful in showing us how many layers and how many processes and how many fits and starts, and your last comment about the multi-tiered is certainly true. The second is you were very helpful in suggesting and reframing again that these are internal actors that have to develop this process. It doesn't mean there isn't a role for outsiders. In fact, many of the observations, you know, we're all too close into our conflicts and our processes. The role of an outsider sometime, appropriately so, might be to do evaluations, to do feedbacking, to provide observations. And we were talking about this a little bit before we started. So just two observations.
Yeah, thank you, John. And I would also like to stress two important points that Mark mentioned, that relationship building was done even before the process has started. So a lot of efforts was input in preparation and in building the ground for the dialogue process, which is probably the most important part in the initial phase. And also about legitimacy. So who has got the legitimacy on all sides, and trust, and actually who has got all of these in combination to good skills to facilitate such a complex process. So these were very good insights to hear from Mark. Mark, there is one question for you. Good evening, Sir Mark. How did you resolve the issue of religious differences in Mindanao?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question because it's an ongoing conflict. So I think the religious, and it's not just religious conflict that is in Mindanao. It's a multi-factor. There are multiple identities that drives the conflict. But I think I'd like to reframe the question: how did we manage those identity differences, those conflicts, within the dynamics of the network? How did we keep it from stopping us from working together? And I think that is why the answer is that is why we put a lot of effort in developing the agenda and developing it through the years. So it's an iterative process, which means it's always open for negotiation. And I think that's actually what, in a very simple term, multi-stakeholder process is. It's an inclusive dialogue, right? So in this case, we were dialoguing on what unites us more than what divides us, or that and that means also that another answer to this is it's, since we are a network of networks and there are many of us, if certain organizations, certain networks, certain sectors are in conflict, for example, the issue of ancestral domain, land issue between the Bangsamoro, the Muslims, and the non-Muslim indigenous peoples. That is the usefulness of having other actors in there who could facilitate back channeling. So even in our case, the back channelings and the peace process not just happening in the formal tables between the government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front or their leaders. It's even happening amongst ourselves, and some of us are facilitating in between actors who might not see each other eye to eye. And I think the third thing is, I think since these actors are engaged, have already a minimum agreement on the principle that why we are participating in this process, which is we are open to dialogue, and that means that we might not be able to find the solution and the answer and a common answer right now. It might take a few more meetings or even years, and that is fine, because and I think that why it's a bit easier to manage this within this network, because that many of us are peace builders, so we could always draw from what makes us peace builders. Why are we together? Because we want to transform, we want to encourage conflict actors, the government and the MILF and the MNLF, to talk. But if we cannot apply that to ourselves, then I think that is a problem. So I think reminding each other of those principles that led us to work together is always an important thing.
And
thank you very much.
Can I just add to that? Kind of a zoomed out and a kind of the principles behind that. That's a really good response in the Mindanao context, Mark, because what I'm hearing is that you have like if you have an identity and part of that identity is we won't talk to terrorists, for example, you know, that phrase, and it's built into identity, then we understand that one of the peace building and conflict transformation skills is for somebody to start building that capacity to talk about it. Because one thing we know is that most violent conflicts to be solved, they end up around a peace talks table in negotiations, dialogues, mediations. And that takes a certain capacity and skills. And when you have, that may be one of the tasks to get to, is to build the capacities into each of the persons who are invited into a multi-stakeholder process so that they have the capacity to even sit at a table or to come to a table for these kinds of dialogues to begin with. And so, and I appreciate that. There are many peace builders in Mindanao, and it's evident that that those skills are being put to use, and it's a long-term task.
Okay, thank you, John. We have another question from Henrik. Hello, Sir Mark. Do you think, although there is no proof of misuse, or maybe there is, and I'm not up to date, the new law, anti-terror law, could be a possible hindrance in any peace process or progressive process? And if the government is the instigator of aggression, who can be at fault, or where or how can we put a blame, as well as how can we solve it? This is a very complex question. Okay.
Yeah, I think this is a bit out of the, but since it was asked, I think it's important to address that. I think I'll answer in two ways. The first one is we do not look at actors as a monolithic body. For example, the government. Of course, there's many of them who the government, the state itself, is responsible for militarizing the discourse. But it doesn't mean that we everyone in the government agrees with that or have the same basis for that. Which means if that is how we look at the government, for example, we engage with OPAP or we engage with the local government, we are able to hone allies within the government that could also bridge, be facilitators, bridge as well our positions to other corners of the government. But secondly, I think what conflict analysis and conflict transformation teaches us is that we do not look at actors per se. The dividers and connectors aren't the actors themselves. It's the relationship, it's the processes, it's the dynamics, relationships between actors. For example, if we apply that to the anti-terrorism law, we might fall into the trap that the armed forces of the Philippines are the dividers because they are dividing, causing rifts. But I think the peace builder in the one who is in the conflict transformation, who has if you have the tools and if you will apply that, you will again look at what are the processes, what are the relationships that I could do in order to again achieve the change that I want to see in the other actor. For example, if we are clear in our position that the anti-terrorism law is dangerous, then if we say already, if we already set in our analysis that there's no hope to talk to the armed forces of the Philippines or to the military, then there's not really a chance anymore to persuade them or to find allies within. But if we are the ones who, for example, reach out, we still invite them. For example, in the pictures that I showed you, we still invited them in that in those meetings, because sometimes the positions that they have might not be because they are fundamentally for or against a particular position. It might be because they don't have proper information. It might be because they don't have any allies. There are forces that that pressures them. But if, for example, civil society are there to provide more information to particular actors within government, that this is how it impacts certain communities, and they do not know that, that might also help change their possessions. Or probably they are in a situation wherein many of those around them are um, for the anti-terrorism bill, but they have reservations. If we do not reach out to them, then they will not speak because they will be alienated within the community that they are in. But if we reach out to them and we expose them and link them to other like-minded individuals who have reservations as well on the anti-terrorism bill, and then provided with the information, that also increases again the the chances that we could persuade them. And again, it's all about analyzing the dynamics, the relationship, the processes that divides us. And sometimes uh, it, it, focusing on the actor itself, looking at the actor in a monolithic way, adds, even makes us as advocates even dividers, because again we are alienating each other from a dialogue. And finally, on the question of how does IID think about the impact of the anti-terrorism bill or law now to the peace process, I think it's devastating. We have a very strong opposition on the anti-terrorism law. We think that it will target and only or open old wounds in the Bangsamoro. But more importantly, I think it will lead to a huge hindrance in the resumption of the peace talks with the New People's Army, which means it's the indigenous peoples that will suffer the most, because labeling of formally designating the New People's Army as terrorists means that talks will not happen, escalation of violence will happen, and that will happen in ancestral domain communities. And indigenous peoples who are perceived to be recruits of the New People's Army will be targeted. Young leaders, activists in the capital, in the universities who are perceived to be sympathizers will also be targeted. And it takes away again the analysis from the roots of this conflict, of this violence, to a short-sighted and narrow and counterproductive approach.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think that this was very good, comprehensive answer. So do we have any more questions, clarifications from participants, maybe for John, because John was our first presenter who presented the whole concept and the steps into planning or multi-stakeholder process. What are important steps to take and what to take into consideration? Or if you still have questions for Mark, that is fine also.
Perhaps I could ask a question for John, because
Yes.
This is also a question for us. I have a sense of an answer that, since multi-stakeholder processes is a process, it means that it could be staggered, laddered. How does it solve the issue of marrying or balancing between being inclusive, but at the same time finding the right time and the right people to talk at a certain phase? Because we know we also have word terms in the peace bill on spoilers, or that they are not ready yet. If we don't call them spoilers, they are not ready yet. So does that entirely solve that staggering of dialogues, or are there any models or modality that that you know of that you could share with us? Because I think that's that's a, that's a real, that for us it's always a real conflict between balancing being inclusive, but at the same time recognizing that some people are not ready to dialogue at this moment.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and certainly in the time frame that your case study covered, Mark, it includes some major spoilers in that whole process. And I think that's why strategically those who are convening the early stages of the multi-stakeholder process need to really think strategically about who to join there first. As I recall, in Mindanao, there was a lot of talk about building a peace constituency. In other words, it was civil society, and it was getting Mindanaoans to start speaking. Just the everyday person to shift a mentality. Well, if the spoilers, so-called spoilers, are at the table to begin with, the process that you intend and may not achieve its desired results. Why? Because they are not yet ready. There's a capacity, there's a learning, there's a shift in knowledge and attitudes that may be the reason for convening the very first multi-stakeholder process, because you have one of the major actors in insecurity who needs to, at least, you need to find a way to get the strategic people at a table, but that may not be the first outcome of the first coming together. And so again, Mark, I thank you for demonstrating how multi-layered and how long, and in your presentation was the demonstrating of certain capacities that had to be built as the network of networks come together, and the full understanding of some of those power imbalances that were there. So I'm not sure if that gets at your question, or if you want to follow up with that.
No, I think as fantastic. Maybe Tanya or other participants also have this observation and also have some thoughts on how to do this. But I totally agree. I think, for example, some of the reasons why the MPW is in the development of the NPPA, the People's Agenda, is that did not include first maybe you'll ask, where is the business sector? Where is the security sector? Where is because again, some sectors are not ready yet, I think, to discuss to talk with another sector. For example, indigenous peoples might not be it might undermine the truthfulness and the openness of the dialogue if we have there, for example, military in the same space talking about in the early periods of the MSP, and the indigenous peoples who sometimes might be the target of attacks from the military or from the local government, harassment from the local government, might not be they might be there. It's a checklist, because sometimes we just do checklists, so they're there. So sometimes inclusivity is not about the number. It's also I think it's about it's about the timing of the and the timing which leads to the readiness of those people to already participate in that process. So in this case, I think while there were differences between the indigenous peoples and the Muslims on certain issues, I think it was already an estimate in the conflict analysis of the networks in the core group that those disagreements are not that fundamental. They are real. They are big hurdles, but they are not big enough to undermine the existence of a candid and transformative dialogue.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of the response to this whole conversation, actually, when we look at tomorrow, when we look at the facilitation of this, and we shift from designing a process to facilitation, perhaps we'll actually find some new insights with tomorrow's input. So yeah, thank you all for that engagement and the interesting day. Tanya?
Thank you, Mark and John. This was very interesting dialogue between two of you about dialogue processes. So I'm really happy that it developed in that way. It is always the best way to have as concrete as possible from inputs from the ground. So that's what Mark did. He's still in the process. So that is wonderful. And John was following this region for years. So he's well aware of the challenges that are still happening there. So I would like also to thank all participants for being with us, for being active. If you have any more questions, you can send us or follow us tomorrow. Tomorrow we continue, as John announced, with more examples, and we'll talk a little bit more about facilitation or styles of facilitation during multi-stakeholder processes. John, would you like to add something to the announcement of tomorrow?
I think that's it. We look forward to having everybody tomorrow, and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mark. See you tomorrow.